we played a clip of Lowry. I can't even remember his first name. Rich Lowry. And I don't know what there is to say about this ban on abortion, but what I find interesting, and we have a clip of Tucker Carlson doing sort of the similar type of dance. They're downplaying it as if it's not like for real. Just briefly, your perspective on what the Supreme Court did here, because we should be clear. They at first ignored the call to enjoin this law from starting. And then they had a shadow docket. They've done it again. 5-4. They voted without reasoning, essentially, a small paragraph to let it continue because ostensibly there's no harm been done yet, which is just, this reminds me of like when they said, racism is dead. Like it's just ephemeral, right? Like the idea that all of these abortion clinics shut down for no reason, right? I mean, it's just absurd. It's just absurd to me that they get away with this. And even John Roberts, I think, was embarrassed by the whole thing. But this is what it is. What's your sense of this?
Well, there are a couple of aspects of this that are interesting. And what you said is true. And they had several days after, because they didn't do this immediately, of course. They just let the law take effect and stayed silent for a couple of days. And during those days, it was clear what harm was happening. Abortion clinics were not able to perform abortions and they were closing down. And how they could come out 2 days later and say, well, there's been no harm. The harm was right there and obvious as the law had taken place. And the stories of what happened on the night before, with people crowding into the abortion clinics, desperate to get abortions before this law came in. I mean, they're absolutely horrifying. There's one on the 19 that is just heartrending. And it tells you exactly what kind of harm this law is doing to actual human beings. The second part of it, I think, the shadow docket aspect of this is really interesting. And it's something that we talked about a little bit, I think, after the moratorium was overturned by the court on the shadow docket. This gives the court an ability to take these really radical sort of stances, just blatantly partisan and political stances, without having to listen to arguments or have any kind of reasoning behind it. They just do it, and it just sort of happens. And in fact, I think Justice Kagan even mentioned this in her dissent on the Texas law. This is getting out of hand. This is not the way it used to be. This is something that they did a lot during the Trump administration, and way more. I think it was like 8 times they'd used the shadow docket during the Bush and Obama administrations combined. And it was something like 41 times they used it during the Trump administration. And they were generally affirming Trump policies. And now we're seeing them generally overturning Biden or Democratic policies. It's very clear what they're using this for. It's for just, simple partisan, achievement. So that is a problem. And, what do we do about that? I don't know. But the shadow docket seems to me like an absurd and bizarre sort of, institutional tactic that really needs to be looked at more closely. And third, I think what you're seeing here is basically the Supreme Court following the lead of the Republican Party, generally speaking, in its endorsement of vigilantism as a way to obtain and maintain power. I don't think there's any doubt about it when you look from January 6th to all the protests that are going on, which are no longer just protests, they're actual intimidation and threats. People coming, I'm bringing 20 strong men into the school board meeting and we will remove you. These people shouting in people's faces, we know where you live, and that sort of thing. This is what's happening. The martyrdom of Ashley Babbitt, the insurrectionist who was shot in the Capitol on January 6th. There is something churning on the right here that is very, very dangerous. And I think what we're seeing is an affirmation by this very conservative, hard right, radical Supreme Court majority that they are tacitly, if not overtly, endorsing this kind of behavior. They have validated a vigilante law in Texas. with what they just did. And to me, that sends a signal all over the place. Citizens, go ahead and do what you need to do. And that scares me almost as much as the fact that that Roe versus Wade is essentially overturned, and we are now dealing with a free-for-all all over the country for women specifically, and most especially having to go through incredibly torturous kinds of techniques to try and exercise their fundamental human rights. So I think there's a lot going on here, and I think we're just at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we should say, I mean, it almost seems silly even to remark that 15 years ago the Republican Party was running on the frivolous lawsuits and civil litigation.
Remember?
Tort reform, yes, of course. The shadow docket thing is also sort of fascinating to me in the sense that that they're not even bothered. Like it's sort of a moment where they just have decided, like, well, let's stop pretending that we're using legal reasoning for this anyways. Right? Let's just do we really have to write a long brief and take 6 months to do this?
Yeah, just
and
one
discuss
paragraph and drop it at midnight.
I mean,
all good.
That's the only part about this that I think is at least somewhat clarifying. Like, this is not a court anymore, right? It is like, what would you call it? It's not, a court theoretically like this would be deliberative and would have plaintiffs and defendants there with an opportunity to make their arguments. And this is just more sort of like a star chamber type of situation where they're just basically like, let's just vote up or down, boom, that's it. And we're no longer going to, it's really just a mini legislature, right? Although there's a little bit less debate, it seems like, going on in this instance. And
they don't answer to the voters. They have lifetime appointments. So their power is immense. I don't think, you got to think about the fact that these guys aren't going anywhere and there's no appeal on any of this stuff.
What also, strikes me is that if you looked at like some in the left leaning, if you will, center to the left, legal establishment, there is still just sort of like a relentless refusal to accept that this is the reality of the Supreme Court, right? Where 2 days ago when, you see some of these people going like, well, when they get to this, you'll see this is not going to, it's the same stuff we heard, frankly, in the lead up to Bush v. Gore, which is this is not a case that the Supreme Court's going to take. Like, there does not seem to be an ability to deplete the delusion that many have at the highest echelons of the legal profession, the delusion that the Supreme Court is a legal institution, or that the problems ultimately when you get to this level, it's sort of like you see this in international law on some level as well. You codify laws, but at the end of the day, there have to be people because this is like the sort of the most nascent expression of society. There have to be people who are willing to not abuse the system, right? Like, you can't at the beginning of any formation of a society, there have to be people who are in a position of power of taking advantage of the system and don't. And we have lost that. That's gone. And one side in this sort of battle is basically still holding on to that idea. Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.